Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday the 21st. And what we're doing is continuing our conversation about Frankenstein. So I left off last class with asking you to view the iconic 1930s version of Frankenstein with Boris Karloff. And as I had indicated, I always think of the film as a very separate entity from the text itself. Though you might have noticed when you were watching the film that in the credits there is an attribution to a Mrs. Percy Shelley, which I think is quite indicative of the way gender was considered at that time, and she not even getting credit with her first name, Mary Shelley. And as you can see, Mary Shelley's text is a very different kind of entity, and I think both tales have power, just in very different sorts of ways. And one of the things that you could discuss is the way that the film has influenced the text and the way the text has influenced the film. But at some point, you will be asked to write a journal response to Frankenstein after we've had some classes devoted to discussing that text. So that would be on the 28th, Wednesday, by 11:59 p.m. Though certainly you could submit in a journal early, where I'm asking you to respond in about a page or so to to indicate your thoughts, your questions, your ideas about the text. Certainly you can utilize this class discussion and any of the comments in the discussion forum as well. I just ask that you send this to me via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, because that's what seems to work best with my grading program. And I'm evaluating it informally on a checkmark system, so I think of it as a kind of conversation on paper. I also wanted to draw your attention to the notes below and the video, and you can see that suggested paper topics are now in our syllabus and other documents folder. This would have been a handout that I would have distributed to you today if we were meeting in person. And we need to talk a little bit more about how to write a formal academic paper, but we've got time because your first paper won't be due until approximately midway through the semester. And if you were to look at that document in the syllabus and other documents folder, you'll see that both paper number 1, which is due midway through the semester, and paper number 2, which is due towards the ending of the semester, are both very similar in that they are critical papers. In other words, I don't expect you to be doing outside research. That said, if you really did want to do outside research, it's something we could negotiate. But do note that that is usually a more difficult exercise because not only do you have to find information from others about a particular text, but you still need to contribute your original ideas. And I very deliberately wanted to have a critical paper because I want as part of this class for you to develop your reading and your analytic skills, your interpretation rather than just mimicking or regurgitating someone else's interpretation. Though of course, class discussion and our discussion forums are giving you direction. Now, the paper length, approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as it would need to be. And what I've done is I've just listed some general topics for you to consider. So these are topics to think about with your reading or perhaps even with your journal entries. Though you can create your own topic as well, and I encourage you to do that. Just make sure you have the topic approved by me. And notice that the topics I'm providing to you are very general. I haven't developed a thesis for you, which is usually the most challenging part of the paper, the position which you are going to take about that particular text. And you are using the MLA or Modern Language Association system of parenthetical documentation when you are quoting from the text. And there is an example below in the handout, but I also will be discussing this as we get closer to writing the paper, and I have some handouts for you about how to write an academic paper. Then I'm hopeful I'll review since you've probably gone through multiple levels of English courses at this particular time. And the syllabus itself reviews exact paper formatting specifications. And again, this is all MLA format, that paper should be double spaced, typed, 1-inch margins, things of that nature. So, what I've done is I've just generated a list of themes that we will be discussing over the course of the semester. Paper number one, my thinking is that it would address one of the earlier works or authors of the semester, probably Frankenstein, but it could also be Edgar Allan Poe or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And paper number two would address one of the later works of the semester, which would be either Lovecraft or The Haunting of Hill House or The Exorcist. Note that I didn't mention Dracula in either one of those because Dracula straddles both. So Dracula would be a possibility for paper one, but it could also be a possibility for paper two because we'll be in the midst of our conversations about Dracula at that point. My suspicion is that you'd probably prefer to write about Dracula in your second paper rather than in your first paper after we've put some resolution to Dracula. Just note that you don't want to have two papers about the same exact text. So you want to have some breadth. So some of the themes, and we've been covering this in terms of our conversations about what to expect in the Gothic genre. Power, violence, the other, that which is considered different or alien from ourselves. Death and or rebirth, the supernatural, that which defies natural explanation. Sanity and or madness, creationism. And note how many of these could be applicable just to Frankenstein. The unknown, darkness. Pursuit and or retreat, fear and or desire. We oftentimes fear that which we desire. Egotism and monomania. If that doesn't describe Victor Frankenstein, I don't know what does. Victimization, wilderness. The forbidden, duality. We talked about the idea of doubling in the doppelganger. Sexual imagery, repression. Depravity, sin. Hunger and or thirst, evil. Lust, passivity, irrationality, chaos and or disorder. And a little note at the bottom that a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, quote, have I or has the author said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible, unquote. And you can see following the quote, there are parentheses that indicate the author's last name and the page number of that quote. That's the MLA system of documentation that we will talk about further. And this is a pretty tall order to say something clearly, concisely, believably, and gracefully. So the sooner you start, the better off you are. And keep in mind that everybody has the option of rewriting the first paper for a higher grade so that you can continue to develop skills to write clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully. So moving on to Frankenstein, and as you noted, probably one of the more glaring differences between the film and the text are the changes in character names, specifically for Victor Frankenstein being swapped with Clerval, Henry Frankenstein, or Henry Clerval, I'm sorry, and Victor Frankenstein. And usually that's attributed to the time period in which the film was made, 1931, and Victor being a very German name. And of course, Germany being in a very sensitive political place, that perhaps it was better to have a American lead character name, as in Henry. That said, you can see also we see some of the typical horror film tropes that you would find in horror film, that there is the hunchbacked assistant, so to speak, and they give us a subplot about an abnormal brain that's supposed to somehow justify the actions of this creature. I highly recommend that you watch Young Frankenstein with Mel Brooks if you haven't already done so, and they'll talk a little bit about that abnormal or abnormal brain. None of that was part of Shelley's vision. And even though the monster, quote unquote, is supposed to be Victor's creature in the film, Boris Karloff, who plays the creature, is a rather empathetic character, as we see with the child drowning scene, which is somewhat different than the scene that we would get with Mary Shelley. But again, it wasn't a deliberate attempt to hurt someone, that the creature lashes out because others lash out first. And that's important in understanding Mary Shelley's text. So, the opening page to Frankenstein, as I had indicated, would be important because Mary Shelley is going to be laying the groundwork for us. And note how often she uses literary references, and that the title, The Modern Prometheus, gives us a sense of the mythology that will be important in terms of understanding this text. Mythology that will be, I think, evident as we read the story. And I'm hopeful, ideally, that you would have finished the text in its entirety, though I am understanding that this is a rather long text and we've got several classes devoted to it. But my hope is that certainly at this point you've had the opportunity to read the opening page and how we are introduced to the modern Prometheus. Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and basically gave it to humanity, and Prometheus was punished for his arrogance, for his hubris. This will be important in terms of understanding a character such as Victor Frankenstein, who does something similar. We are given a quote from Paradise Lost, which happens to be a great epic poem written by John Milton, and it happens to be about the very famous biblical story about the fall of man. Paradise Lost is a very complicated text, however, because although we know that Satan is supposed to be the villain, because ultimately Satan corrupts humanity in the biblical story by tempting Eve to eat the apple, the reality is that Satan is presented in a rather sympathetic light, created by God to be the most beautiful angel and then abandoned by God for another creation. So that is something for us to consider as well, particularly as we continue to read the text, and the creature will be comparing himself to Satan and make references to Paradise Lost. But the quote we're given in the opening is, "Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me?" And think about how that could be applicable to modern day. No child asked to be created from their parent. And of course, the sin from Victor Frankenstein's perspective is that he's created the creature, but the bigger sin is that, as we find out, he abandons the creature. And again, think about all the modern day parallels that one could have with parenthood and one's parent's responsibility to one's creation or one's child. So, as we move on to the text itself, we see that we are given a text that's in letters. There's a term for this. It's known as the epistolary novel. It was a very common technique at the time for storytelling. It is also, I think, a very complex technique, because in some ways it gives validity to the text because we've got a written record, but in other ways it increases the ambiguity of the text because it is subjective. And this entire story is told through Walton, and we can easily forget that as the story progresses. And Walton is basically writing letters to his sister when we see that Walton is going to give us Victor's account through the exact retelling of Victor's story. In fact, even using the I. But the I is not Victor. The I is Walton recalling what Victor said about himself. And eventually we're going to get the creature's tale. We never get the story from the creature. We get the story from Victor retelling what happened to the creature. And again, we get the story ultimately from Walton retelling what Victor is retelling from the creature. So you have narrative embedded within narrative embedded within narrative, which leads to an element of ambiguity. How much can we trust this text? Certainly we know that Walton is not in terrifically good physical or an emotional state, which leads us to question his reliability. Usually the text is read that we will assume that Walton is giving us a certain level of reliability, but note how the entire text could basically be dismissed as a figment of Walton's imagination or an element of his subconscious, which is one of the elements of Gothic that we are oftentimes provided not just with a supernatural explanation, but also with a level of ambiguity that would allow us to come up with another more natural explanation if we didn't want to accept the supernatural explanation. Walton is very similar to Victor. This would be a great paper topic or a great journal topic. The similarities and differences between these two characters. It's one of the reasons why Mary Shelley gives us this character. That Walton has isolated himself in an attempt to achieve scientific greatness, which is something that Victor does as well. that Walton has removed himself from female presence in his life. In this instance, that would be Margaret, his sister, and in Victor's instance, that would be Elizabeth. And the negative consequences that result from that. We know that Walton is basically on the brink of a ship mutiny. And he tells his sister in letter 1 that I prefer glory to any enticement that my wealth placed in my path. And we'll see something similar to Victor. And in the second letter, Walton continues saying that he has no friend. And he's about to go to regions that have been unvisited, exploring the unknown, and that's a common element in the Gothic, but also this idea that isolation is almost always a negative thing in the Gothic. One of the messages in the Gothic and in horror film is that community brings safety. This is a very common trope in horror film when you see the characters become separated and you know that ultimately that is not going to be a good thing for them. In letter 3, Walton talks about what can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man. And again, this is very similar to Victor's thinking, and we see the consequences of that when Victor creates his creature. And note that I use the language creature, not monster. The true monstrosity is Victor and humanity as a whole. It rejects the creature, even though the creature is born, basically, if not a blank slate, then benevolent, because we see how he appreciates nature, and we see how ultimately he tries to help humanity, but is continually rejected over and over again because of his hideous appearance. And think about how that could be a commentary about our own society as well, about how we make judgments based on physical appearance, and often many of the biases and prejudices that we have as a society are based on appearance, things like racism or ageism. So in letter 4, Walton talks about how he's met Victor, and that Victor was basically traveling on the waters, and that he was able to take Victor in onto his ship, and said that Victor was not, as the other travelers seemed to be, as a savage inhabitant of some undiscovered island, but a European. So as progressive as Mary Shelley might be about issues about, let's say, race or prejudice or gender, we can still see her own bias definitely for European, and it begins right there. And in letter 4, Walton continues on, and he talks about how Victor said to him, I sought for the dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race. An unhappy man, do you share my madness? The idea is that Victor is going to tell his tale so that Walton does not duplicate the same mistakes Victor has made. However, we will see Victor vacillate throughout the entire text, that although this is supposed to be a warning, oftentimes Victor refuses to take responsibility for the consequences of his actions. So we're not necessarily sure how sincere Victor is, or at least how embedded Victor is in the idea of accepting responsibility. And in letter 4, Walton says about Victor that he was a slave of passion. And in fact, one could say the same about Walton as well. They're both slaves of passion. And then we get Victor's story in chapter 1, and it sounds like we're getting it from Victor himself. But again, we have to remember that this is Walton's retelling of Victor's story. And not only is Walton in a poor state physically and emotionally, but he also is trying to transcribe everything word for word hours after the fact. So you can imagine the possibility of the narrative being distorted. But nevertheless, Victor tells us that as a child, he was their parents' plaything and their idol, and something better, their child. And this strikes me as a very interesting quote, first of all, because when Victor thinks about creating a creature, which could be viewed as creating a kind of child, it almost seems like he thinks of it as a plaything or a possession. Also, the irony that he's treated Victor so well in his childhood, but yet he abandons his creation. In fact, he doesn't even give his creation a name. So the title of the story, Frankenstein, is not the title of the creature's name. It's the title of the creator's name, Victor's. So chapter 1, Victor talks a little bit about how his adopted sister came into the family, that she was a child who was very thin and fair, and that till death she was to be his only. And this becomes eventually Victor's fiance. Notice that they aren't blood related, but it would have been uncommon in the 1800s for cousins or other family members to be assigned arranged marriages in order to be able to keep bloodlines and inheritances intact. And Victor continually refers to Elizabeth as a kind of sister or cousin. But again, in terms of blood, she's neither. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about Edgar Allan Poe and the idea of the possible incestuous relationship. But nevertheless, Elizabeth is chosen to be adopted by the family because of her physical appearance, which is much more European, and she's got the typical look that would be considered to be positive, the blonde hair, the blue eyes, as opposed to the other orphans that the family encounters. Again, we see Mary Shelley's European bias. In chapter 2, Victor talks about how the world was a secret to him, which he desired to divine. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that he desired. Now, there's a very common text that is oftentimes quoted in Frankenstein, and this is Dr. Faustus, which was a play that was written by one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, Christopher Marlowe, and it happens to be the story of a man who is seeking infinite knowledge, so much so that he makes a deal with the devil. The consequences are not good, as you can probably anticipate. Not only does Dr. Faustus not necessarily get what he was promised, can't expect the devil to tell the truth, but also Faustus wastes this knowledge. At first he talks about how he wants to benefit mankind with knowledge such as the ability to live eternally, and then he wastes his time with using his knowledge for pranks, turning himself invisible, for instance, and then tormenting leaders of the church. The ending of the play is a cautionary tale, a morality play, if you will, that you don't make a deal with the devil, because when Faustus is basically dragged into hell, those were the terms, that he would be given unlimited knowledge so that ultimately the devil could claim his soul. And throughout the play, Dr. Faustus tries to convince himself that either he has enough time to repent so he can enjoy the knowledge he's been given, or that there is no possibility of God accepting his repentance because he is so evil, therefore he may as well enjoy. But the consequences are that he enjoys. And by the ending of the play, when he's pulled into hell, that's the time that Dr. Faustus tries to repent, but it's too little and too late. And that's the message for us. And we see how Victor will be somewhat similar in that Victor wants the knowledge that is forbidden to humanity, that's only available to the gods. And while Victor says that he has good intent, we see that ultimately Victor negates his responsibilities so that there will be negative consequences associated with that. Mary Shelley was well aware of this when she was writing this story. In chapter 4, Victor says that he shunned my fellow creature as if I had been guilty of a crime. Two things here I wanted to point out: the idea that he's isolating himself, but more importantly, how often he says things like, as if I was guilty of a crime. He is guilty of a crime, trying to create life from death. We aren't given many details, but it's a pretty gory situation where he's visiting the charnel houses to try to find body parts. And also, the only one who should be able to create life is God, or perhaps female, and Victor usurps both. Notice how female is rejected in this text, and there are negative consequences as a result. I think this is the way that Mary Shelley was being progressive. No, she doesn't give us a central female character. Instead, she gives us a central male character who isolates himself from female, and a society that isolates female, and the negative consequences that result because of it. And the scene that probably is best known, again because of Hollywood, is in chapter 5. This is the creation scene. It's a dreary night in November and basically establishes the mood or the setting that we've established for Gothic literature. And I thought I'd read that to you, or at least some of it. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my foils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes. My candle was nearly burnt out, when by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. Now I'll skip a little bit. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, which seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. Obviously, very different than what Hollywood gives us with this square faced and bolt ridden Frankenstein. And it also, I think, if you wanted to get a sense more of a more accurate portrayal of the physical appearance of the creature, what you could do is watch a version of Frankenstein with Kenneth Branagh and Robert De Niro, where Robert De Niro plays the creature, actually. But nevertheless, again, Hollywood in the 1930s has sort of cemented this iconic green skinned square visage for us. But regardless, what we do see is that very typical of the Gothic, this is occurring in late fall, early winter, at nightfall, candlelight, again, establishing everything associated with the Gothic mood. It was also a time when there was scientific interest in things like electricity, and you could see the importance of electricity and reanimation of life through electricity in this text. Now, as iconic as this text is, this is not to say that there aren't weaknesses within the text. One in particular strikes me in chapter 6, when Elizabeth says to Victor, and again, so much of this story is through letter writing. So Victor is talking about a letter that he received from Elizabeth. Justine, you may remember, was a great favorite of yours, is what Elizabeth is saying to Victor. Now, I always chuckle at this because if Justine was a great favorite of the family, then Victor would not need to be reminded. That was a way for introducing this character, Justine, to us as audience. And what we find out about Justine, even though just or justice is in her name, she experiences neither. That it turns out that the creature, and again, we'll get the creature story later on, is responsible for the death of William. It happens to be Victor's younger brother, in part because the creature realizes that William and Victor are related, and the creature is angered about the fact that his creator Victor has abandoned him, and the creature wants justice or revenge. And then he even places the blame on another person, and that happens to be on Justine, who happens to be in the wrong place in the wrong time. And Justine would seem to be guilty because she's carrying a miniature locket that William would have had on him. So there's a piece of physical evidence. And Justine is forced to confess. And she does confess because she's she's threatened with excommunication from the church, which again goes to show the power of the church. And again, in reference to female, feeling that there was no other option but to confess to a crime for which she is innocent. And one of the things I talk about in my women in literature classes are the 4 virtues that were associated with a good female at the time, known as true womanhood. And one was definitely piety, the threat of excommunication, what that could do to females, so much so that this female confesses to a crime she never committed. And again, we aren't given many female characters. We know that ultimately we have an Elizabeth who fits into the stereotype of the female at the time, very passive, and perhaps Justine does as well. But we will be introduced to other female characters. And I will suggest that all of the long passages that Percy Shelley perhaps encouraged Mary Shelley to add about the descriptions of the natural world not only lengthen the text, but since we oftentimes associate the natural world with female, Mother Nature, that perhaps is our central character, is the female Mother Nature. And notice that when Victor and the creature embrace nature, things go much better than when they both reject nature and the natural world. So that's something to consider in terms of gender as you continue reading this story. And I'm going to end with chapter 9, that we see that this creature is quite articulate. It gets into the issue of nature versus nurture, one of the elements that you might have heard of in psychology or philosophy classes. Are we influenced by our birth, by our nature, or by our environment, by our nurture? It's usually viewed as a combination of the two. But we know that upon its birth, so to speak, the creature basically appreciates nature and the natural world, which is definitely an element that we would see as a positive. And then when he observes the DeLacy family, which we'll talk about next class, and again, perhaps we have to suspend some disbelief by just observing a family, he's able to teach himself how to read or write. Definitely that shows his intelligence. But I dare any of us to teach ourselves how to read and write merely through observation. But nevertheless, the creature is able to do that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But when he realizes that some of his actions are hurting the family, for instance, he's taking their firewood to keep himself warm, he stops doing that. So again, he's concerned about others, which is another element that would show the goodness or the benevolence of the creature upon birth. And the creature, again, not only appreciates nature and again engages in benevolent activities and teaches itself language and uses reason, but ultimately it will find a satchel of books. Yes, we're going to have to suspend some disbelief. Teaches itself how to read, and some of the books include Paradise Lost, which I was referencing. And the creature will compare himself both to Satan in Paradise Lost, who was created and then abandoned by God, and also Adam, who was basically created and then again through the seduction of Satan is abandoned by God. So this is where we'll continue next class for our discussion forum question. And keep in mind, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses. And then if you are moved to respond to any of their responses, certainly you can do so, much like you would participate in a live class. You're also required to read my responses to you and all of your peers. Again, that will give you a sense of what we would have talked about in class. The attendance question, which will be due on Friday, the 23rd at 8 a.m. And again, if you need additional time, please let me know. To identify an important quote in Frankenstein and why you think it's important. I've shared some with you, but I'm asking you to find a quote that struck you as having some level of importance and talking about why. Again, no right or wrong answer. I'm just more interested in your reasoning and your thinking. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about the creature and the DeLacy family in Frankenstein. Take care. Bye-bye.